being interrogated while innocent. So I would describe that as, I mean, it's definitely kind of a disorienting, frightening type of thing. Um, I mean, there's different phases of that. I mean, there's there's the interview, there's the interrogation. So, I mean, there was my interaction with the police was not limited only to the day of the false confession. There was about a 6 week run up to that, in which half the time they would talk to me like I was a suspect, and the other half the time they would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. So when they would push too hard, they would get me, they would get me feel frightened, and I would start to withdraw, and I'd want to leave. That's when, they would change tactics, and Jeff as the junior detective investigator helper would be what was emphasized. And so, during the interrogation with them in that 6 weeks, I would say it was definitely confusing. It was disorienting. It was kind of like a emotional roller coaster, going from one end of the spectrum, to the other. That was amplified by the good cop bad cop technique, in which half the time, in which one officer takes on a more aggressive role, and the other one pretends to be a friend who's opposed to what's going on, but powerless to intervene. So the officer had been pretending to be my friend. He would be the one who would really play up the Jeff as a junior investigator helper theme, whereas his partner would, do the most of the questioning when they would talk to me like if I was a suspect. I mean, it's definitely it was a lot of pressure to be under, and it was kind of confusing at times in terms of when they would question me when as a suspect. I mean, it was a lot of pressure, and it was confusing. It was frightening. That was compounded by my age, which was 16, and and also that I just wanted them to stop. I mean, I didn't really have the means to make them stop, because what they wanted, which was me to confess, I mean, and I didn't have the ability to do that because I knew I was innocent. But again, when they were pressed too hard, that's when they would shift gears, and Jeff is the junior investigator helper, and they were able to fool me as to that, because before I was a teenager, I wanted to be a cop. So that, and the fact that I came from a single parent household, and I began to look up to the officer who had been pretending to be my friend. I began to look at him as a like a father figure type of person. So that that added those characteristics of me. Certainly complicated things. They gave me different details of the crime. The police are supposed to withhold non-public facts. They're supposed to withhold that not just from the suspect, but also from the media. And so if somebody volunteers those facts in the course of an interrogation, then that's looked at as like a type of corroboration. It's looked at as proof that they have guilty knowledge. But in the course of the interrogation, they would, they at times they suggested details to me, and later when I did falsely confess, I incorporated those details that they had given me into the false confession. I would say another aspect of that I want to cover is, just being 16 years old. I mean, I didn't. The law requires that when you waive your Miranda warnings, it's supposed to be a knowing, willing, and intelligent waiver. I didn't understand what was meant when they would read me the Miranda warnings. I didn't know what was meant when it was said, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. In my mind, whenever they would get to that part, the court of law, I would, my mind would go to like a civil court, and I would think, court, what are you talking about? What court? We're not going to court. So I didn't, and then that further complicating things was the whole Jeff as a junior detective investigator helper type of theme. I mean, that also added to my not understanding, what the Miranda warnings were really, really meant. Moving on to a different topic, in terms of being incarcerated while innocent. So let me say that I knew a lot of prisoners. I mean, as you all know, I did 16 years before I was exonerated through DNA testing. And as you might imagine, I met a lot of prisoners there who were guilty. And I had a lot of conversations with them. I interacted with them. I socialized. I played chess, basketball, ping pong, talked sports, and did different educational and vocational programs, shot the breeze, hung out, however you want to phrase it. I did it for the most part. So in the course of that, I had a lot of conversations with people, and and they really didn't have anything to lose or gain by talking to me. Like I was a cop, and they were already convicted, so there was no real concern on their end that it was going to lead to them, getting caught, getting arrested, being incarcerated, otherwise being punished. So a lot of the prisoners there, they had worked themselves into this place where their mindset was, look, I did what I did. I got caught, being punished for it. So I'm not going to cry about it. I'm going to just make the best of it and try to go home as quickly as I can. Excuse me. I was never able to get to that place, that place of comfort, because I knew that I didn't do anything. I was that I was innocent. So while they, generally speaking, had a pretty good idea of how much time they were going to be there for, I didn't. I didn't have that certainty. So I knew I had a 15 to life sentence, but I believed, I knew I was innocent, and I still believed in the system. And I rather naively thought that the higher up in the court one went, the more accurate the judges were, the higher their level of expertise was. And so I thought I was going to win the next appeal. So that meant that I could go home, within the next 6 months or the next 2 years or 3 years. Or on the other hand, I knew that I could be there forever. My sentence was 15 to life, which means you have to do the 15 years minimum. The maximum is the life part of it. So there was never a point in time where they were going to be legally obligated to release me on parole. And I knew that the parole board didn't want to hear people say that they were innocent, that they wanted to hear people express remorse, take responsibility, show insight into their behavior. And I knew that I wasn't going to do that. So I didn't know how much of my 15-year sentence I was going to do, if I was going to win an appeal, or if so, at what point, or if I would never get out because I was never going to admit guilt. And then of course, what complicated things was the fact that the parole board, they're supposed to just evaluate, whether, if you were released, if you were likely to remain at liberty without breaking the law. They're not supposed to obsess over nature of the crime, certainly not this remorse aspect to it. But I knew that they were in the habit of rubber stamp denying applications, even from people who could demonstrate they'd been rehabilitated. They would just reference, if they were incarcerated for a violent crime, I mean, that was it. They would just, deny them based on nature of the crime, and then they would reappear in 2 years and then get turned down again and continue on with everything. So I didn't know how long it would last. So that was another distinction between doing time while innocent versus doing time while guilty. I had to fight off feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, thoughts of giving up. At times I thought about suicide. So it was much a mental or emotional thing as it was external versus the prosecutor and versus the court system. Let's see, what else can I say about that topic? There was another point that I wanted to make. Give me a quick second. Yes. Well, another thing is that in terms of the depression aspect to it, you know, a lot of times I want to just lay down and just not respond and just not do the prison routine. I felt like just laying down in my bed and not getting up and not going out for the program, not standing up for the count, just refuse to participate in anything, but I knew that I needed to go to the law library. I needed to study the law. I knew, and to do that, I couldn't be getting in trouble. And I knew that nobody was coming to my rescue. So if I was going to get out of there, I was going to have to hold it together mentally, because I would need to recruit somebody who could help build that bridge between me and the substantive legal assistance that I needed. So in a way, I didn't have the luxury of losing my mind, or giving into the depression thing. Sometimes people ask me, how did I survive the 16 years? And a lot of things were true at the same time. Certainly, belief in God was one thing. I learned the law, so going to the law library and learning the law, that gave a sense of solace, comfort, and like if I was fighting back. I used to collect articles of other people who had been exonerated, and use that as motivation to keep going. I used to read 3 or 4 nonfiction books. I had a little routine in the prison, so like on the weekend, I used to listen to sports talk radio on the day when we were just locked in our cell most of the day, but it wasn't really listening to sports talk radio. I mean, it was part of a routine, but B, it was more like a lifeline to the outside. And, on that day, that would be the day that me and the person in the cell next to me, we would cook food together, and I would cook certain parts of the meal and they would cook the other. So I look forward to doing that. And I really liked the NFL season, because on Sundays during the regular season, the playoffs, I would, there would be a 1:00 game, a 4:00 game, and there would be one at night, Sunday night football, and there would be Monday night. So, I mean, I would enjoy watching the football on those days, and it was something to do. I engaged in an elaborate delusion. When I would go to recreation, I would play either basketball or ping pong or chess, but I would pretend like if I was a professional player, and that everybody else was also, and that the gym was like a road game, and this armory type place that was at home, and the people on the sidelines, I'd pretend, people who were watching us play, I would pretend like, they were the fans. But it wasn't like kids just fantasizing on some playground, of being an athlete one day. I mean, it was more like a survival mechanism. I mean, I needed to get out of the prison for a couple hours. So I engaged in that elaborate delusion. I'll send around a link before we disconnect, but I wrote an op-ed about that, about the role of sports in prison and the role of sports in me surviving my ordeal. I wrote an op-ed on that topic, actually, that Sports Illustrated published. I can't take credit for the nifty title. They called it The Most Captive Audience. So I'll send that link around, but that was also part of, how I survived my ordeal. I'll tell you that at times I questioned, I actually questioned, I couldn't believe what my senses were telling me. I mean, could see the prison walls and the cell bars, and I was in the prison uniform, and the guards were there with the keys and the boots and uniforms and the routine, all the cues, all the mental cues were there. But I couldn't, so I knew I was in prison, but I couldn't, sometimes I questioned whether I was actually there. I mean, it didn't quite seem like if it was real. It seemed like every factor, everything that had to go wrong in order for me to be wrongfully imprisoned. I mean, it felt to me like the odds of any one of those things happening was slim, much less for all of them to happen. And yet they all did. And I couldn't quite believe it. Another factor in terms of how I survived, I used to also cut out nature scene pictures, and there was like a big square section of the cell wall, and you were allowed to put pictures there of any kind that you wanted. And so I would cut out pictures of that, and we used to use the state toothpaste as glue and put on the back of the pictures and fasten that, and I would go to sleep in such a way that when I woke up, the first thing, my head was such that when I woke up, the first thing I saw was the nature scenes. Before I took it, there would be plenty of time to get the cell bars and everything else in there. So, yeah, so I did that. I mean, and in that context, I want to share that male takes on a disproportionate level of importance. So in that, while you're there, we had a saying, that we used to call it a drive-by. When the officers would come around with the mail at 3 o'clock and they would pass by your cell, they're moving faster because there's no need for them to stop. Whereas if they have mail, they're going to slow down. So we would call that a drive-by when he would come by and not drop off mail because, that hurt. That hurt not getting mail. I mean, in that context, even junk mail took on some importance. I mean, now that I think about it, just somebody will remind me. There's another article that I want to share. Let's make a note here. It's the Sports Illustrated article, but then there was also the article which was called "Everyday Objects Inside versus Outside Prison." So that might be a fascinating read for you all as an elaboration of this topic. Let's see what else. The after effects. Let's discuss the after effects of wrongful imprisonment. So it's I used to see mental health professionals about 4 times a week for 6 years in order to cope with the after effects of being incarcerated and in trying to readjust. I'll say that it's common for people the common after effects involve post-traumatic stress disorder, related symptoms, panic attacks, anxiety, feeling of processing things at a slower speed than the rest of society, feeling of having been frozen in time, altered personality, mood swings, fear on seeing law enforcement. So I had to deal with all of that. And then, when I say feeling of having been frozen in time, what I mean by that is I was released when I was 32. And I often felt like if I was 17, because that's how old I was when I was last free. So there was that, there was that disconnect. The world was much different. So technology was different. So the internet, GPS, cell phones, none of that had been created. Zoom didn't exist. Neither did Skype or WhatsApp. So all the technology was all different. The culture was different. And dance styles were different. Music was different. What was considered to be in or trendy or hip was all different. And so I had to relearn all of that, the culture and everything I just mentioned, and the technology. Cities and towns that I used to go, that I would visit, they would have a lot of houses, buildings, and other structures that were familiar to me. But then there was just enough there that I could recognize them. But then plenty of other things that had changed. So, and the people that I knew that used to live in those neighborhoods, they had long since moved away. So when you take all those things together cumulatively, the technology, the culture, the physical change of neighborhoods, the people being different, taken cumulatively, it often felt like if I was in a parallel world, that one that I didn't belong to. I'll share that it was particularly difficult for me to readjust. So I was part of a subset of a subset. So meaning people who were wrongfully convicted when they were younger. It's a much more difficult readjustment, in my opinion, than somebody reintegrating who maybe was 25 years old or 30 or 40 when they were wrongfully imprisoned. So what I mean by that specifically is I had never lived on my own before. So I never lived on my own. I didn't have a driver's license. I only had a permit before. I never had to go shopping, so I had to learn how to go shopping. I never paid bills or had to pick up my own mail or wrote a check, balanced a budget. So all of those things were new. I had to be taken shopping a few times, and even then, my initial solution to what to do in the future was that I would save the empty container when it came to cleaning products and other household items. I mean, I would save the cartons and I would empty bottles and I would take them back with me to the store to then, to then purchase them again. I mean, there was kind of an overload of sensory stimuli. I mean, there was so many different kinds of items and so many different brands and so many different quantities, the weight, how much it was, and price points, and well, this is more than that, but is it really higher quality? Or if I get the smaller version of this, is the extra amount actually worth it to pay more? Those things were very difficult for me. So there were times when I went shopping and it became too much. And so even though I had a bunch of things in the shopping cart, I just felt, I can't deal with it. I would just like push the cart away from me and I would just walk out and just come back to it some other day. So that was an example of that. There was a stigma attached. So it wasn't around my innocence because my charges were dismissed on actual innocence grounds. The actual criminal was identified by DNA, arrested, convicted. There was the study on what went wrong in my case. So really, nobody questioned my innocence for the most part. But the issue was more, all right, well, you were in prison for 16 years wrongfully, yes, but you were in prison for 16 years. How much of that rubbed off on you? Is it safe to be alone someplace with you? So, that has proven to be a difficulty when it comes to personal relationships. In terms of a job, so I was never able to obtain gainful employment. It seemed like all of the business owners or managers, gatekeepers, they all seemed to want somebody who could hit the ground running, who understood the technology. Whereas, I would need to be taught some of the technology. I would have needed some patience to receive some on-the-job training. And so I was always passed over based on that when it came to meaningful employment. A few times I encountered a couple of other obstacles which are related to the stigma. So one time somebody told me that they weren't sure how the public would react to me working there, and they didn't want to have people protesting outside their business. And so although they felt empathy with me, they felt like they couldn't hire me. Another person told me, well, that they didn't know how their other employees were going to react to me and that they could run the business without me, just using them, but they couldn't run the business using me if they all walked out. So again, they were not going to, they declined to hire me based on that. And so, I really never had, I was never gainfully employed. I mean, I was working as a weekly columnist, but the problem is that, and I was making good money per article. It was, sometimes it was $300 an article, sometimes $250. But the issue is that they only was a weekly newspaper and they only wanted one a week. I was making money doing speaking engagements, but that's not a consistent form of income. So, things were very tight for me financially. At one point, I nearly was 2 weeks away from going to a homeless shelter, Mercy College, which had given me the scholarship to get the bachelor's degree and the books and the meal plan. They allowed me to live on campus, which is how I avoided the homeless shelter. It was a very awkward experience whenever I would meet up with my members of my extended family. I mean, I knew who they were intellectually because I had memories of them when I was younger, but I was a different person then, and so were they, and a lot of years had passed by, and it was very hard to communicate with them. I knew nothing in their background would allow them to really understand what it was to be arrested for something you didn't do, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully imprisoned, the difficulties in reintegrating afterwards. So, and on their end of it, a lot of them felt guilty that they didn't, they didn't support me on a morale level, that they didn't come visit, or that they, didn't write, or that I wasn't, able to call them collect, or different times when my mother, a couple of times she made the rounds and we were trying to just get everyone to put a certain manageable amount of money in so that I could hire a lawyer, and, people declined to do that. It was kind of a curious phenomenon because there were really only two members of my extended family which doubted my innocence, but the rest of them, they believed in my being innocent, but that belief didn't lead them to assist me on whatever level that they could. So there was that type of collective guilt on their mind, and there was that awkwardness. And I had some conversations with people who apologized in terms of that. I'll say another after effect of being wrongfully imprisoned was that really my social life was kind of knocked off the tracks. So I had long since lost track of. And you get arrested, normally, you lose a lot of the bulk of your friends, and certainly the few that were still there, they jumped off the wagon when I was convicted, except for a couple of them. But the longest friend that maintained touch with me was about 5 years. And so, yeah. But I mean, eventually, I did most of the time by myself. My brother is 3.5 years younger than I am. He was impacted by my wrongful conviction also. So the kids in the school bus used to tell him that his brother was a rapist, and they would say other nasty things to him. And, they would try to stab him with pencils. And so he eventually, dropped out of school and turned to drugs and alcohol. And he wound up cleaning himself up, but he still, he never went back to school, and he still retains a lot of the street mannerisms in terms of, cuss words and terrible language, and his manner of dress and his manner of acting. He still acts like if he's a common street criminal running the streets. So that's been another after effect of being wrongfully imprisoned. I want to talk about advocacy work. So a lot of people ask me if I'm angry, and the answer to the question is I'm not angry. I mean, I want to enjoy my life as much as I can, and I don't think I could do that if I was angry or bitter. Another line of reasoning with that, leading to that same conclusion, is that I want to enjoy myself as much as I can. I can't do that if I'm angry or bitter. I lost so much. Why would I want to, in effect, give over the rest of my life? If I did that, I would really be the only loser. It's not like if I did that I would somehow be, negatively impacting on the people that had a hand in what happened. The vehicle which allows me to actualize that is that I take the energy that I feel and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do. I make sense of everything through, I believe that my mission in the world is to fight wrongful conviction, and that so I kind of found myself. I have my purpose. I take meaning in that. I think that doing advocacy work is meaningful. It's certainly healing and cathartic, and it's nice to make a difference. And I'm able to take some solace in, I'm able to take some silver lining in making a difference. So I've done a lot of presentations around the country, and I've traded, and some around the world. I've traded the decision to trade privacy in exchange for awareness. So, I do a lot of television, radio, print media interviews, new media. So I do interviews with people with podcasts and blog writers and online publications, blog talk, radio. You name it, I've probably done it. And I never know who's listening or who I might reach or in what way. So, doing presentations, media interviews, I meet with a lot of elected officials. I go to legislative hearings. I testify on legislatively, on different bills pertaining to wrongful conviction or other criminal justice issues. I tell them, what's a good idea, what's not. Most of the time they don't listen to me. Occasionally they do. But, you do the work because you want to at least do your best. So I do that. I was an individual advocate for about 5 years. During that time period, I got the bachelor's degree in behavioral science, which is a psychology degree without having to take statistics. Knew you were going to smile about that. I got the master's degree from John Jay College, criminal justice. I have a Master of Arts. My thesis is written on wrongful conviction causes and reform. So I thought that getting the formal education would add to the advocacy work that I was doing. So after about 5 years, I was able to get some financial compensation, and so I decided that I wanted to take my advocacy work to the next level, and I started the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, whose purpose is to free wrongfully convicted people and pursue the policy changes. So kind of the work I did before, except that, from a collaborative team approach, and which would also incorporate trying to free wrongfully convicted people. And, we've been able to free seven people in what's now close to our 7 years of work. We've been able to pass 3 laws pertaining to videotaping interrogation, identification reform, and DNA database expansion. The bill on pertaining to videotaping interrogations came out watered down. The legislature made exceptions for second-degree murder, sex offenses, and drug offenses. So we're trying now to circle back around and get rid of those exceptions, because the obvious thing to say is, if we know that wrongful convictions caused by coerced false confessions have been the cause of wrongful convictions in 25% of the DNA proven cases, in which cases would it be acceptable to have a wrongful conviction caused by a false confession? The answer should be none of them. So if that's the case, then why do we have these exceptions? So we need to get rid of these. We need to get rid of these exceptions. There is a coalition group called It Can Happen to You, which I'm an advisory board member of. The foundation is part of that. The founder is Bill Bastick, who was a former county he was a county legislator, and he was a town council person, and he had also worked as a staffer to an assemblyman in the New York State legislature. But he was falsely charged with the rape, which he didn't commit, and he was acquitted in 2 hours after a year. But it cost him his reputation, and more than $150,000 in legal fees. And so he did some work after that, and he discovered that what happened to him wasn't uncommon, except for the fact that most of the time people were wrongfully convicted. They didn't have the resources to, hire a top-notch lawyer and experts. And so he decided to build a coalition group using his inside politics and knowledge of coalitions from his days as doing political work and environmental work. So he started the group very early on. He contacted me. We were introduced to a mutual person, and I've been his right-hand person. And so I'm kind of like the lightning rod for the media work, and I'm the group's liaison to the exoneree community, and we lead with my case, and he has the structure and organization and the insider baseball type of knowledge. So we've worked together, and we were able to pass 3 other laws in New York: a Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, so oversight board for prosecutors, a tweak to that law, and then we used that coalition, and we formed an even bigger one. We got other groups together, and we helped to pass discovery law reform here in New York, which pertains to the information sharing process. So now it's automatic. The prosecution and defense, they have automatic reciprocal discovery instead of the prosecution having all the evidence. And then, before, under the old law, what they were doing was, on the eve of trial or before an evidentiary hearing or other pretrial hearing, they would have to turn over prior witness statements from the witnesses that they were planning to call, and then they were supposed to turn over information that was deemed to be helpful to the defense, called Brady material, but they wouldn't turn over anything else before that, and everything would just be at the last second. And now it's automatic, and both sides have to turn over information, at the same time. You have to, so it's automatic that way, and it can eliminate a lot of unnecessary litigation around discovery. So in terms of the commission, the New York State District Attorney Association, they brought a lawsuit. They challenged the constitutionality of the commission. The judge rejected all their arguments except one. He found a flaw in the appeal process. So he invalidated the statute, but we're in the process of repassing the bill, just making that slight tweak. We have chapters in Pennsylvania, and where we're working on bringing the commission there, and we're also we're working on there's a bill really close to passing, which would pertain to automatic expungement. So people who've been exonerated in court would automatically have their records expunged, and Pennsylvania is a state that does not have compensation, so we're working on trying to pass that also. We're in California. We're trying to bring the commission there, and then also we're trying to fix their compensation system. So there you have to pass a private bill, and even if they passed it, it would be for each person, by the way. And even if they passed it, they would only get $140 a day, which is an insufficient amount of money. So it seems like a good segue to talk about wrongful conviction causes and reform. So obviously prosecutorial misconduct is a major cause of wrongful conviction. It runs through most of the cases. So the reforms in that area would include the Commission on Prosecutor Conduct. There's another doctrine called prosecutorial immunity. So if they've engaged in misconduct after an arrest, and they have immunity. So that means you would not be able to sue them in court. They don't have any oversight in the civil realm. So the answer to that obviously is the commission and removing immunity. I would like to see clear-cut intentional misconduct to be a felony. It is an e-felony in California. It's not anywhere else, although no one's been prosecuted for it there yet. So we look at the commission as an enforcement vehicle to that law, so that offenders could be identified. Bad lawyering is a major cause of wrongful conviction. I advocate for one statewide system, so there could be oversight, quality control, that we should have a limitation on caseload, so it's not unusual for one public defender to represent 100 people at the same time. We need to have an even playing field in terms of financial resources between the district attorney's office and the public defender's office. There's an imbalance now in terms of the budget, manpower, experts. I think that both sides should get equal pay so that the best talent doesn't go to one side or into private practice. And I think it sends a message that one person's job is more important than the other. So that would be another reason to have equal pay. Misidentification has been the cause of wrongful conviction in 75% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions. So the best practices, would be sequential viewing, taping the whole process, the double blind method, telling witnesses that the suspect might not be in the lineup, that the investigation will continue if they don't make an identification. There shouldn't be everyone should resemble the description given so that no one sticks out, and there shouldn't be a congratulatory statement. So those are the reforms in terms of that. Some of the variables would include whether a weapon's used or not, or how good someone's eyesight was, what the distance was, age, whether a weapon was used. I mean, when there's a weapon used, the eyes focus on the weapon rather than the face. If you get the chance to watch the 60-minute special, What Jennifer Saw, that's really good viewing on that topic. Certainly, witnesses are not supposed to be allowed to consult with each other You know, and so that's another issue. Some of the wrongful conviction cases that have happened in misidentification cases, they've been significant height and weight discrepancies given between an initial report and the defendant. So certainly those things are red flags. Lying informants have been the cause of wrongful convictions in 15% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions. So having an external evidence corroboration requirement would be a reform there, meaning no one should be convicted based only on informant. In terms of podcasts, so there is a podcast that we haven't launched yet, but we have about 18 episodes that we've shot. It was called "It Can Happen to You: Exposing Injustice with the Deskovic Foundation." I'll send around the link once we launch it. I've done a lot of podcast interviews. Some of the more recent ones. One of them was a podcast called Skull Fragments, and that's posted on my wall. I have a Facebook page, obviously with my name, which I'm going to send now, and I post it on my media interviews. But I'm close to my 5,000 limit, but I do have a public figure page also. So you Google, it's the one where I have a picture of me, and whatever I have on my personal profile, I copy over and put on that page. When all this craziness stops, there's a short 20-minute documentary, which is called Conviction, which is a short document about my life and advocacy work. So that's something to view if you're into virtual reality. So there is a product, the first episode about my story is called Once Upon a Time in Peekskill, and it has launched. And so it's on the Oculus website. It's available there for purchase for $2.99. And if it does well enough, then we'll shoot the whole first season, which will culminate into my arrest. So I'm going to share with you some photos now. Let me make my PowerPoint. Everyone can see? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, wait, hold on a minute. This isn't, give me 1 second. Okay, from the beginning. Okay, this is my mugshot. So I look like in court when I was, the note was sent out that the jury reached a verdict, but prior to the verdict being read, this is being when I was sentenced. Short, so that was, it looked like when I was in prison. This is another early photo of me. This is one of the photos when I was released, hugging my mother, opening the foundation with the red tie. That's Fernando Bermudez, who did 18 years in a non-DNA case. That's Jabbar Collins, who did 16. In the corner, you might recognize Raymond Santana from the Central Park 5 case. If you get the chance to watch the Netflix series When They See Us, I would encourage you to do it. There's also a documentary called Central Park 5, so that's very good as well. That's probably the best documentary out there when it comes to the intersection of race and wrongful conviction. This is William Lopez, who did 23 and a half years. He was the first person we helped exonerate. We collaborated with his pre-existing legal team that had been with him for about 9 years. He passed away after about a year and a half. Second person we exonerated to my left, that's William Pauley, who did 8 years and 4 months on an arson case that was actually an electrical fire. This is my presentation that I did when I went to the country of Armenia. That's Bill Bassick in the big red tie. Next to him is Professor Gershman, who's considered to be the country's leading expert on prosecutorial misconduct. He does frequent media commentary. So that's when I got the award. I got my Private Sector Servant of Justice Award for my role with It Can Happen to You. This is the team in Pennsylvania. So starting from my left, the tall guy with the baseball hat on, that's Drew Whitley, who did 20 years. Next to him is Terrence Lewis, who'd been home for about 8 months. He did 21 years and 8 months. There's Mark Whitaker right next to me, who did 17 years and 5 months. And then there's Bill Bastick right there. Again, you could see him, and that's the rest of our Pennsylvanian team. I've done presentations as an ethics instructor in police academies in a nearby state of New Jersey. Wrongful conviction is about accuracy. It's about justice. It's against injustice. It's not anti-law enforcement or anti-government. It is against rogue police officers and prosecutors. So as long as they're doing the right thing, I have no issues. So this is one class. There's another one. Third one is a group of correction officers that I spoke in front of. And here's when I got my master's degree, immediate interview. So I got the law school degree. This is my co-host. Can happen to you with Exposing Injustice with the Deskovic Foundation. And my crazy dream. We have a crowdfunding site on my Patreon website. You type in Patreon and Deskovic Foundation, it'll come up. And so it's not a site for people who want to do a one-time donation. It's for people who are comfortable doing a recurring monthly donation. So my crazy idea was that if we found 25,000 people who could afford $3 or even $5 on a monthly basis, we could have a really large budget and we could be able to get a lot more people out of prison. So one way to get involved, I mean, I obviously need people to contribute, but I also need people to help me get the word out, verbally, whether it's on social media or other ways. So let's see. So maybe the last thing I'll briefly cover is I'll just discuss red flags that a confession may be false. I understand you've done 3 classes on false confession, so I won't repeat. I'll just mention some of the red flags that a confession might be false. These are just red flags. It doesn't mean they automatically are. Lengthy interrogation combined with food deprivation, that's a red flag. Misuse and abuse of the polygraph, that's another red flag. There's a high correlation between the usage of the polygraph and false confessions. The suspect, the police stop a suspect and correct them on a detail, and then they correct them because they got a detail wrong, and starting over again. I mean, that's definitely a red flag. I remember that you can Google the John Kogut case. He gave 5 different versions of a confession before a 6th version of it was accepted. If a confession is contradicted by external facts, that's a red flag. So Selwyn Day's case, we did 17 years out of Westchester. So he said he broke in the side door of the house, except that the house had no side door. He said he kicked the dog to death, but the veterinarian said that the dog died of dehydration. He said he left a bloody knife in the sink, but the knife in the sink didn't have any blood on it. He said that he took his girlfriend to an abortion clinic after the murders, but that abortion clinic records showed that that happened a year before that. A decade before that. And he said he left the abandoned vehicle in Delaware, but the police never found a vehicle like that. So that's an example of that. The suspect is asked a lot of yes/no questions rather than open-ended questions. That's a red flag. So it doesn't take much of anything just to say yes or no, but the police are asking open-ended questions when the suspect has to supply answers. That can be used as evidence to show guilty knowledge as a type of corroboration. If the police mention something in their questions and then later on a suspect regurgitates that, then that's also a red flag. If you've seen Making a Murderer, when Brendan Dassey is asked what happened to the victim's head and he doesn't know, and finally police asked him, well, did you shoot him in the head? I mean, that's an obvious example. Shoot her in the head. That's an obvious example of contamination. If the sophistication of language exceeds the formal education or life experience of a suspect, that's a red flag. Certainly the police writing a confession out is a good flag. If you get a chance to watch the documentary, I'll type it out here, Murder on a Sunday Afternoon. I would suggest watching that. It's really dramatic how the defense lawyer, he's in court questioning the suspect, questioning the police officer, and he turns like 5 huge pages of this confession that's blown up, and he's saying, well, so none of this language is him, it's all you, and it's just so obvious, what was going on there. It's a co-defendant situation, and the co-defendants give different stories. That's definitely a red flag. Central Park 5 is definitely definitely an example of that. So with that, I will end the presentation and just open up for Q&A.
Jeff, do you want me to record the Q&A too?
Yeah, that's fine. Why not? Yes.
I'm going to move this to gallery view so I can see everyone's face. It's in the top right-hand corner. Okay, everyone, you can use the raise hand function if you want, or you can just open your mic.
So was there a moment where you kind of came to realize that you actually were in prison, this was actually happening to you? And if so, what was that moment that made you realize that?
No, I mean, I think that was, I was aware of that generally. I mean, it's just that at times I would question if I was really there and if that was really happening. Next question.
I know you touched on this briefly when we watched the videos, that your lawyer was more like it's not on them to prove your innocence, it's on the prosecution. But did your lawyer either during the appeals or during the initial process truly believe that you were innocent?
So ask me the question again. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So I know in the videos and in the interviews you had mentioned that that your lawyer had said that it was not on the lawyers.
Like, yeah. My lawyer, yeah.
So
So yes, yeah. So well, I mean, that's a legal principle. I mean, the defense doesn't have to prove anything, but that's kind of a legal principle. It's not how it works in reality. I mean, in reality, I mean, you as an attorney, I mean, you have to do everything you can to prove your client didn't commit the crime, or you run a risk that they possibly will be wrongfully convicted. I mean, particularly in a false confession case, there's an 80% conviction rate in cases where there's a confession. So, you have to answer that confession. You have to explain that confession. You need to put your client on the stand, explain why they falsely, confessed. You need to introduce alibi evidence. You got to disprove as many aspects of the confession as you can. And if you don't, then you run a risk your client will be wrongfully convicted. I mean, most people don't think that an innocent person would ever give a false confession. But the jury is made up of everyday citizens. So you have to that's what I mean by that.
So did your lawyer truly believe that you were innocent, or?
I think that he did once the DNA didn't match me, but he still didn't, he essentially didn't defend me.
Okay, Natalie Marino, I see your hand raised.
I know you mentioned some of the differences, like some of the hardships that you had adjusting to the outside world again. So I guess what in your opinion was the hardest part about just being thrown back into the outside world after 16 years?
Most difficult part. I think trying to rebuild things socially. I mean, everything. I mean, the psychological after effects is is really hard, and trying to readjust, and the technology, culture, and world being different is also hard. Certainly, being released with nothing is very difficult. I think the most important part really was just the social aspect to it. Next question.
Sahara, did you have your hand raised?
I did, but as I was listening, I realized that I forgot.
You can either raise your hand or just open your mic. Either will work.
So obviously you've talked about how you've met other exonerees and people who have been wrongfully convicted and wrongfully imprisoned. Have you guys talked about your experiences, and is there a lot of overlap between people who have been in similar situations, or is it really diverse as far as your experiences?
Yeah, I definitely have talked about it. There's definitely a lot of overlap. I mean, each person's experience is somewhat different, the particulars, but yeah, the particulars. But I mean, but there's a lot of similarities. So I mean, we, get together and we talk to each other. It's like we're speaking the same language. It's almost like the same phenomenon that people in the military feel. I mean, they may not have served together or in the same theater of war, but just the fact of having been in the military or having been in combat is enough. I want to add that there have been about 18 people that I've done time with, either before me or after me, that that have been exonerated. There's been about 18 people who've been exonerated either before I was or after that I did time with. So I just want to add, it's it has a different feel to it. It feels a little bit weird seeing people on the outside, because while we were only in 3 of those situations was I aware that somebody was that they were innocent. Also, I mean, it's not really something that was talked about. I did one other way I did survive my experience. There was another prisoner there named Frank Sterling, who we used to get together once every 6 weeks, and we would try to keep each other's morale going, and we would brainstorm about what the next move was, to make to try to overturn our wrongful convictions and regain our freedom. So he was exonerated a couple of years after I was. I've sent some links. I've sent some links in the chat. Murder on a Sunday Afternoon, Once Upon a Time in Peekskill. That's the virtual reality. Everyday Objects and Concerns, Inside versus Outside of Prison. I've thrown in a link to an article, Careers in the Innocent Movement, and I also have included the link to my op-ed in Sports Illustrated called The Most Captive Audience.
Okay, Sahara, your hand's back up. Do you remember now?
Okay, yeah, so I did remember, as it just I spaced out for a second. Sorry about that. So I was wondering about how the reforms that you're fighting for, mandated interrogation recording, if that was something that happened to you during your interrogation.
Yes. So my interrogation was not. Yeah. So my interrogation was not videotaped or audio taped. There was no signed confession. So I think if it was, it definitely would have been. Yeah, if it was, it definitely would have made a huge difference, because when the police officers came to court, they left the threat and false promise out of their testimony, and they would not have been allowed. They wouldn't have been able to do that, and it would have been clear that I was being, coerced.
Can I jump in really fast too?
Yeah.
I don't know if you all saw this, but it was, I guess, the guy playing good cop even told Jeff that once he would just confess, he could just go home. Isn't that true, Jeff?
That is true. Right.
Emma, is your hand up now, Emma?
Yeah, so I know you spoke about some of the reforms for people for fixing, interrogation processes, and also people who have been wrongfully convicted who have now been exonerated. I personally think that right now, anyway, the justice system isn't doing enough for people who have been wrongfully convicted and exonerated. Do you agree with that? And
Yes.
if you do, what do you think the justice system should be doing to correct that, other than preventing them in the first place?
Right. Yeah, I do agree with that. And so I think that when someone is exonerated, that they should immediately be provided with housing, cost of living, doctor and dental care, mental health services, job training, job placement, classes on technology, access to public transportation, university education, books. So I think that should be provided automatically. I know one deficiency in Florida in particular, they have the clean hands provision. So if someone's been convicted of a crime prior to having been wrongfully convicted, or if they're convicted of something subsequent to the exoneration, that they would not be eligible for compensation. And I think that that's definitely a reform that should take place. I mean, if someone was wrongfully imprisoned, then they were harmed by that, and they deserve to be made whole by that. And that injury doesn't, disappear if they're unfortunately arrested for something afterwards. So I think that those things should be done for exonerees. I think that, it's important. In a way, I consider the reforms, though, to be doing something for the exonerees in the aspect of, I feel like the state morally owes it to people who've been wrongfully imprisoned to plug those holes in the system so that nobody else is wrongfully convicted in the exact same way. So that, there's that's always a big concern. I want to add another thing is getting an apology. I mean, I know it sounds silly in a way, but most exonerees do not get an apology. It does mean something. If you get an apology. In fact, sometimes they say things in court like, well, we're dropping the case. We don't consider that so-and-so is innocent. It's just that if we retried the case now, we don't think we would be able to obtain a conviction. And so they kind of cast aspersions on somebody's innocence afterwards. So it's kind of adding insult after injury.
Sahara, is your hand raised?
Yeah, I have one more question. How do you think your life would be different if you had all these reforms, or if you were in a state that had compensation? How do you think your life would have been different when you were exonerated?
How I think my life would be different in what? The last part of your question trailed off.
Oh, if you were in a state that had compensation laws or had all these reforms.
Well, I am in a state that has the compensation laws. I mean, that's New York. They have it, but they don't have the immediate assistance. So I think that, I would not have had that really difficult first 5 years of freedom. If I had, I wouldn't have had the instability of housing. I wouldn't have been 2 weeks away from being in a homeless shelter. I would have had all the tools that I needed provided to me by the state, and I would have been able to reintegrate back into society and put my life back together again a lot quicker. I wouldn't have had to rely on, random kind acts by private citizens, strangers, and it was really a obligation of the state, and we can't rely on that. I think if we had all the reforms passed that's necessary, then I wouldn't have to do all this policy work. So I would know that the system would be more accurate that way. I wish that we would be able to have the reforms passed, but I'm still working on it. So I'm also including my master's thesis. So if anyone wants to read it as supplemental supplemental reading. I would encourage the book. I'm typing it out now. Actual Innocence by Jim Dwyer. That's a great primer. And of course, the more advanced book after that would be Convicting the Innocent. And that's by Brandon Garrett. So he's taking a scientific approach and, pulled stuff out, went to the original transcripts and, pulled stuff out and put it into a data set, crunched numbers, et cetera, et cetera.
Natalie, Marina?
So I know you were just talking about like how an apology means like more than anyone would think in
Yes.
situations like this. I wanted to ask if anyone ever actually apologized to you, like anyone that you felt was actually at fault.
No, nobody was actually at fault. I mean, I got a symbolic apology from the district attorney, but she wasn't the DA when I was convicted. I mean, the trial judge and the prosecutor, when I was exonerated, they apologized to me, but they weren't the people who originally were involved in my case. That wasn't the trial judge. That wasn't the prosecutor in the courtroom. So I never got an apology from any of the people that were directly involved with what happened to me.
What would you say the biggest challenge is for getting this legislation passed and implemented in areas?
Well, definitely the biggest challenge is the District Attorneys Association in New York. If we could get them on board to, cooperate with us and be in favor of the reforms rather than fight everything, that would certainly make everything easier. They recognize, they agree with most of the reforms, except that they have this weird position that they think that, the best practices should be voluntary rather than the law. And that doesn't make any sense. Beyond that, I think the more elected officials recognize that, these reforms are about accuracy and justice and preventing wrongful convictions, and that wrongful conviction is a public safety issue in a larger sense, because when every time the actual criminal actual wrong person is convicted, the actual criminal is free to strike again. I mean, that's what happened in my case. The actual criminal killed the second victim. So I think that the more elected officials realize that it will be easier to pass legislation as opposed to some of the politicians who get elected on tough on crime platforms. If they would stop seeing wrongful conviction as reform measures as being opposite of being tough on crime, if they would stop seeing it as being soft on crime, I think we would get someplace. I mean, honestly, in a way, we don't talk about it this way, but in a lot of ways, these best practices are about being hard on crime, honestly. I mean, because it's going to lead to getting the actual criminal, right? So deterrence happens when punishment is swift and certain, and these best practices are all about catching the actual criminal. So that's what the main holdup is there. I do want to add that I do have a secondary interest in a lot of other criminal justice issues. I mean, I feel very strongly that there should be college education for prisoners. I mean, there's a recidivism much lower. So Hudson Link, which is a nonprofit that brings college education to prisoners in some of the prisons in New York, their recidivism rate is like 2% compared to the national average of 68%. I was in college while I was in prison, and I saw how the education transformed people. I mean, suddenly their horizons were expanded and people were fantasizing about different careers that they wanted to have when they got out, rather than just, reminiscing about the old days or, planning future crimes. And, this time we're going to get away with it. We'll account for that camera that was in the back. That was our downfall. We're going to account for, so the whole conversations would change. So college education for prisoners certainly ban the box, which has to do with preventing, with doing away with the doing away with the requirement that a job applicant has to check the box stating that they've been incarcerated previously, or doing the same thing when it comes to applying to college. So my issues there would be that, the way that it should work is, is that after someone applies, either they're extended a job offer or not. And as long as the conviction is not related for something that impacts, so you're not going to work as a bank teller if you've previously been convicted of robbing a bank, right? That doesn't make any sense. But if someone is offered a job and the conviction was not related to it, then that employer should have to come up with some reason. They should only be told of someone's record after the fact, and they're going to withdraw a job offer. They have to have a really good reason. Otherwise, that should be illegal. It would be discrimination. Because if it's other than that, if we're going to make it hard for people to obtain jobs and lead crime-free lives, get gainful employment, so then what do you think is going to happen? That's not hard to figure that out. Just like, obviously, if someone is applying to college, then they must be planning on living a crime-free life. So why should we refer to their history and denying an educational opportunity? To me, it's kind of unseemly. Mass incarceration. I think that there's a lot of people incarcerated that don't need to be there. Yes, there are innocent people. I think the percentage is 15 to 20%. There's a Wayne State study that estimates 10,000 people are wrongfully convicted each year. There's some articles that reference 120,000 people wrongfully in prison, so we can thin the population that way. But beyond that, there were a lot of prisoners there who, a lot of elderly people who are elderly. I think that it makes no sense to keep elderly people in prison. Certainly, people who've committed crimes like 10, 15, 20 years ago that are model prisoners now. What's the sense in doing another 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? I think there's a lot of people that have been over sentenced. There's people there for nonviolent offense. I knew people in prison that were sentenced to more time drug possession than they had more time than other people that had killed people or had committed, assault with a deadly weapon or other acts of violence. That doesn't make any sense to me. There's a lot of people incarcerated for committing technical violations of parole. I think that there should be penalties. I think that there should be accountability, but I don't think sending somebody back to prison for a year, for 2 years, because they failed to tell the parole officer about their change of address or they broke curfew. It's not a cheap thing to incarcerate somebody, and I'd rather have somebody paying into the tax base rather than to be sucking money out. So those issues right there that I mentioned. Certainly solitary confinement, which has been proven to either cause mental health issues or exasperate them. I did 28 days in solitary, so I know what that's about. So that issue, and I have an interest in that issue. I think that we should not incarcerate kids with youth, right? So I think that maybe until someone's 23 or 24 years old, they should not be grouped with adults. So I was sent as a 17-year-old, I was sent to a men's maximum security prison where I was around fully formed adults. So I think it is dangerous, and I think that the possibilities for negative influence are there, just like I think that prisoners who are identified by security as having special security needs, just people who are likely to be prey, or people with mental health issues, people incarcerated for sex offenses. I think they should be, other vulnerable populations should be kept separate from the rest of the population so that, abuse doesn't go on. It's not about being soft on crime or soft on criminals. When someone commits a crime, the punishment is supposed to be the loss of freedom. It's not supposed to be mistreated, while you're in prison. We need to improve the medical care. We need to reform parole. I think that when people have done their time and they can demonstrate rehabilitation, they should be released rather than this obsession at expressing remorse, rather than continuing to deny release just based on the nature of the crime. I mean, that's something that's never going to change. That's why somebody lost their freedom. The judge took that into account in fixing a prison sentence. So that's never going to change. So to use that as a reference to, as a reason to not release somebody flies in the face of rehabilitation. I think that prisoners should, in general, be housed in prisons that are closest to where they came from, so that they can that they can get visits easier. I mean, there's prisoners who have community ties and family relations. Statistically, they have a much better chance at a successful reintegration into society, into a crime-free life, than those with no ties. So why, like in New York State, there's a troubling practice of incarcerating people who are from the city. They're sent to the prisons that are in upstate New York, and those who are from upstate New York are sent to prisons near the city. And then they have to earn a transfer closer to home. But I mean, that's backwards to me. Now, it's in all of our interests as a society for rehabilitation to happen. So why would we put obstacles in the way? Just like I think that, we should not allow discouragement of visits, which is, some of the guards, they're nasty, or they're slow to bring the prisoners out for the visits. They do things to discourage people from coming. And I think that that's the opposite of what should be allowed. I think that, and I think there needs to be more professionalism, and that, verbal abuse and other things need to come to a cease. So I think we need to have updated curriculum when it comes to the vocational shops. I mean, I did a lot of programs, but a lot of the programs I did have minimal educational value. So I completed 6 certificates in plumbing, but the bulk of my training was in cast iron pipe or regular metal pipe. And now these days plumbing is copper and PVC. So if I wanted a career as a plumber, for example, I would start at virtually the same place that somebody else that did not go through the program did. So I think that there should be updated curriculum, and I think that the prisoners should be tested periodically, and there should be some oversight and quality control so that we can be sure that the instructors are actually teaching rather than are just there for a paycheck and just sitting down. So I feel strongly about all of those issues.
Haley, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I did. I was just wondering if like law was something that you were interested in before you went into the prison, or like had this whole situation happen to you, or was it something that came as a result of your experiences?
I was interested in law before that, so I wanted to be a lawyer previously, but so my mother had a personal injury lawyer, and he had he had the suit on and the Attache case, and he seemed to be gainfully employed. He seemed to have quite a bit of respect with him, and I wanted to be a lawyer based on that. Now, so in a way, I still fulfilled the dream, but I mean, I wouldn't have the emphasis on doing wrongful conviction work that I have now. So, I mean, I did graduate law school. I passed the bar. I just got the results in from the test on New York law, and now I have to do the character and fitness interview, and then just go and register, and then I'll get the law license, and then I will officially be a lawyer at that point. Anything else? Other questions? Dr. Quinlivan, any topic anything you want to ask me, or any topics you want me to address that hasn't come out already? I think she briefly stepped away for a second.
Yeah, sorry. I was checking on the babies. They're still alive. The people aren't here yet, though. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? The last one was from Haley.
I have a brief question regarding like what would you say are your next steps to continuing to reform the whole justice system and fix the wrongful?
So in New York, the steps are videotaping. Well, we have the videotaping of interrogations, but we were trying to get rid of the exceptions to that. So that's a goal in New York. And then there was a program pertaining to, we're trying to reinstate work release. So work release was a program that, prisoners who are like 30 to 60 days short to the going to the parole board, where they would get a job in the community, and they would work there, and they would just be incarcerated on the weekends. They would come. So we wanted, that program was discontinued for people who had been convicted of violent crimes, but it was working for everybody before. So I think, again, if someone could demonstrate rehabilitation, I don't think they should be categorically barred based upon that. So that's part of the work. In Pennsylvania, we want to pass the expungement bill. We want to get a bill passed that would that would compensate exonerees, and we want to pass the commission there. California, we want to pass the commission, and we want to also fix their compensation system to not require a private bill for each person. So those are the immediate goals. I am trying to raise funds. I want to, again, have an in-house staff. I mean, I wrote large check, every month for like 3.5 years. So I'm trying to raise funds now through different ways, including the Patreon campaign, and so that I could, instead of having to rely on the volunteers and lawyers that I pitch cases to, we would have in-house staff. So that would allow us to increase our case capacity, our efficiency. We'd be able to get people out faster that way. Aside from that, another thing with that is that when we got funds in the door and we hired a full-time policy person, we would expand our advocacy work, our model of building a coalition and going after reform. We would expand into 3 states. And, Florida is one of the states we would want to come into for sure. And, Dr. Quinlivan, a lot of it has to do with Dr. Quinlivan, but I have a lot of connects also in Florida, and so does she. So, we want to expand into Florida in the future, and and probably in Connecticut and like one other state. So we would want to be involved in other states also. So using our blueprint for success. And I'll say that, as an individual, I'm always, I endorse, or I look for, people running for district attorney who are on the same page as me in terms of, they see the big picture. They're against wrongful conviction. They're for the reforms. They're for the other justice reform issues that we spoke about. So I know right now, I'm backing Mimi Roca, who's running for Westchester County District Attorney, which is the county where I'm from. So she's, running on all those issues that I mentioned. So, just trying to help. So Mimi is a great example, but that's certainly not the only campaign that I have been involved in the past, or that I'm even involved with right now. So, I am interested in that and trying to help get other people, elected that are interested in doing justice reform work. So that's also, part of it.
And I just wanted to add as well, there is an application process. We actually started trying to start helping Jeff with his work. It was supposed to be this semester, but you see what happened. We lost a professor, and then now we have Corona. So basically there is an application process if any of you are interested in helping out. Some of the things that we had planned on doing would be to form like a list of groups, a list of places where we could actually have Jeff go and speak so that we could raise money for the foundation that way. We need someone really, really good at social media to help us keep all the social media up to date. I have trained. Now you have to actually take psych and law and be trained for this, but I have students currently trained to actually help me review cases. And right now we are reviewing a case, but Jeff has sent me some Florida cases as well. So you all wouldn't be able to do that yet because it takes a bit of training. But there are ways that you can help, and there is an application, and it's not an automatic thing. So you have to, write an essay that shows that you really are willing to put in the work and what you can do to help. And it's not that long of an application process, but if any of you are interested in it, you really should talk to me about it.
Yeah, we definitely need help with all types of help with the Patreon campaign as well. It does cost money to do the cases and to have all the personnel in place to really have, really efficient machine. All right, so one more time, any other questions? Anything I've talked about, anything I haven't talked about today, anything that's fair game? I'm pretty comfortable, I'm pretty open with everything. And hopefully I'll have 15 new people who will follow my my page, my public figure page on Facebook. I'll send the link around as well. So if you like my work and you want to keep up with me, I post everything there that I post on my personal profile. So my media coverage, upcoming presentations, that kind of thing.
While he's doing that, are you sure none of you have any questions? Are you good?
Okay, let me just get this link and then here we go. Okay, put this here, here we go. Okay, all right, well, thanks for listening, everybody. It was, hope you enjoyed, hope you got something out of it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Q, we can't hear you.
I was saying I'll leave this open long enough for you to grab all the links in case you haven't yet that are in the chat that are in the chat room, and then I will close it after that. I think Jeff has left. So yeah, just grab the links. There, I'm not used to having myself muted. So all the little babies are still moving. They're like this big. So I hope they're okay. I don't know. These people are supposed to be here any minute, and they're not. And the mommy's dead, and the little babies are breathing at least. But hopefully they actually take them to rehab and don't I'll just start crying, then they'll have to. So do you all have any questions for me? No? Okay. Well, I'm going to go just in case these people come, and I hope you enjoyed getting to hear Jeff and talk to Jeff and learn from him. And I think I accidentally recorded about the possums, so that's going to be on Jeff's thing. Let me undo